Hello, and welcome to Health and Fitness Redefined. I'm your host, Anthony Amen. Join me today as we take a dive into the world of health and fitness, where we learn how to overcome adversity, to pick the fact versus fiction, and see health and fitness in a whole new light. I know I say it a lot about how excited I am to have this guest on, but this is a topic that we literally have never covered before. It is something that is going to be brand new to a lot of people, and in my eyes is super important because we exercise, we eat right, and we implement all these things in our life to increase our lifespan. And that's the general word. Like, I want to live a longer, healthier life. This guest I'm going to introduce us is doing research into that longevity. And we're going to talk about how you can live longer and what all the stuff she's been working on. And I'm really excited to really find out more about what's going on. So without further ado, let's welcome to the show, Erin. Erin, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on today.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Anthony. Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited, like I said, and just kind of talking about how to live longer, what to look for, what do scientists look at. But before we do any of that, just tell us a little bit about who you are and how you got into this field in the first place.
Sure. I have a very windy path, an interesting one, but I've done a lot of different things. So sometimes folks look at it and they go, how did you get here? But I'm like, I promise there is a thread. So yeah, my career background spans finance and media, doing hosting on television, kind of like what you're doing here. And then, of course, biology and biotechnology, which is the sector that I'm in now. And really, that's sort of underpinned by this lifelong love that I've always had for the human body. I am a classically trained artist. That's actually what I went to school for since childhood, through a specialized high school and college. So my undergraduate degree is in fine art. And my particular focus was always the human figure. So I did a lot of nude figure studies, anatomy. I did stone sculpture of human form. And so I was always interested in the body and considered medicine as a profession. And for one reason or another, didn't do it, largely because it felt like a very expensive and long time commitment when you're 22. That's not a decision everybody is capable of making, but more power to the people who know that's what they want to do at that age. And so, yeah, it was just always something that stuck with me. I, right after college, was a swim coach for a junior U.S. Olympic team, had my personal trainer certification, just like you, Anthony, was really interested in health and wellness. And then through this sort of long, windy story, which I won't go into unless you want me to, ended up in the field of biology, went back to school, got my master's in biology a couple years ago from Harvard. And then now I'm currently at Harvard Medical School, completing my Master of Bioethics, because the field that I work in with genetics and epigenetics requires certainly ethical consideration as we deploy these kinds of technologies. And so, yeah, it's just something I'm very, very passionate about. And I have my own personal story, as I'm sure many of your listeners can relate to, about how I personally came to be interested in it, going through a health problem myself, lots of different twists and turns. But ultimately realizing this is the thing that I'm most passionate about. And the nice thing about health and wellness and anything really with the biological sciences is that I really do think it is interdisciplinary. So when you start to think about how can we heal, how can we make life better for our species, for other species, it requires a holistic approach. It requires creative thinking, right, which may integrate elements of the arts and the social sciences as well as the hard sciences. So that's a long-winded way of saying how I came.
It's all good. We got a good general understanding of kind of who you are and where you come from. You mentioned, like all my guests pretty much do, and everyone that gets into this field, where you had something in your own personal life that kind of projected you onto that. And that's always the story we hear over and over and over and over again. And it's just so true, because when you get that self-motivation, like, oh, I was able to accomplish A, and now it pushed me to accomplish B, and I can help others with it. So I'm interested in, briefly, what is that story? What happened that kind of pushed you forward?
Yeah, so about, oh gosh, time is slippery now since the pandemic. So I'm like, how many years ago was that? Probably about 12 years ago. I became ill And it was one of those situations where, again, as I'm sure so many of your listeners can relate to, especially female listeners, because females' health problems are more often dismissed by the medical establishment or have historically been not understood. No one knew what was wrong. And so I was like, well, this is not an acceptable answer. I'm a person who likes answers. I want to, I want to have some agency over my health outcomes. Surely there must be information to help me. And so I sort of started down that path of, self-diagnosis and self-healing with the aid of literature. But I would say that despite being a very educated person, I did not have a science education, not a technical academic science education at that point. I was very able to read literature, but like so many people, I think really wasn't 100% capable at the time of understanding the results of studies, the statistical power of a certain study or what a different cohort size might mean. And so I was able to sort of pick out different things from the literature that I applied, some with great results and some with not so great results. And so ultimately, really what it was me trying to heal myself. And ultimately I did. We got to a place where there was a diagnosis, and I was able to use very natural approaches along with a particular medication to heal myself and to have a totally normal, healthy life. And so that's when I really realized, wow, it's not just the power of nutrition, which in my opinion is almost everything, but it's also your mindset, how you think, who you surround yourself with, what kind of information you consume, how well do you understand that information, and then being able also to evaluate the legitimacy of that information. And I would say, who do you want to be around you on your care team, and so all those things just made me even more passionate about understanding the wonders of the human body and saying, okay, now I'm in a position maybe to be able to help other people, so they don't have to go through what I went through. And I think that's just a very common theme that most folks can relate to.
What was wrong?
I prefer not to discuss my personal medical diagnosis.
No worries.
but I did have a lot. I did have a lot of symptoms that a lot of, I think, women specifically, ages 25 to 45 probably experience, a lot of this unexplained fatigue and brain fog and unexplainable pain and weight gain and hair loss and vision changes and all these things that are not particularly well understood as sort of a comprehensive picture. And thankfully now that is changing. But for so long, when people would go to a physician and say, I have this set of symptoms, some physicians would say, well, that's just in your mind. We'll give you some Valium or we'll give you an SSRI and it'll clear it right up. When actually, there's a physiological basis to why people are unwell, and that is not always just psychological. And in fact, the two are intertwined, so you can't disentangle them necessarily.
Interesting. Would love the whole background. Love how it kind of projected you forward with that. And how did this connection come to work for the company, which is FOXO, which is what we're really going to be talking about? Where did that happen? What was that transition like?
Oh, yeah. So I had been working for the past 6 years for a personalized health and wellness biotech startup. They're no longer a startup in Cambridge. And I spent about 6 years doing that. They were really first to market in this realm of, hey, we'll test your blood and then we'll give you these very precise, personalized recommendations. When we started doing that, that was not something that was very common. People didn't really understand it. Now, of course, people do understand it. You can buy blood tests without a physician's order, and you can go to Quest or LabCorp, have your blood drawn, then you have this whole analysis, or in some cases you can do it at home. And so I was doing that for quite some time. Found that really interesting. Saw it really, it was really effective for people to be able to have insights into how their body is dynamically changing and how the environmental impacts, how you sleep, how you exercise, what you eat, how that's actually affecting the picture of your blood chemistry, because we were using blood. And then helped build the DNA product for that company. And then, as I mentioned, I went back to school to get my master's degree. And my thesis was on epigenetics and longevity. Specifically, I was looking astronaut Scott Kelly's methylome, his epigenome. So if you guys remember, Scott Kelly, the twin, went up to the ISS for, at that time, it was the longest period. Someone else just broke the record, almost a year. And he came back down and they said, oh, he has all these genetic changes and, his telomeres are longer. And there was lots of media headlines. And so, yeah, so I was fortunate enough to be able to work with the folks at Cornell, who had access to Scott Kelly's methylation data. This is his epigenetic data. Ran some analyses on that in the context of what did that mean for longevity for this guy, or for anyone who might go to space, and what might it mean for the rest of us, because I was very interested in longevity. And then FOXO, the company that I work at now, which we'll talk about, they came calling as I was finishing up this thesis, and they said, listen, we're working with epigenetic science and longevity. And we're applying it to life insurance, but we're a longevity company. And I was like, wow, the universe has really conspired to bring me intersect with these people who are doing this exact thing that I'm studying right now. And no one else is doing it, not in this way. So I was super excited. So I happily joined them. I'm now our chief product officer. Been doing that for, I think, just a little over a year now. It's been really exciting. And for anyone who doesn't know, FOXO, FOXO, the company, is named after the FOXO gene. It's actually a family of genes, but FOXO3 is implicated in human longevity. And the FOXO family of genes, which are implicated in longevity, actually are highly evolutionarily conserved across many species. And so I did not come up with the name. I think it's an awesome name, but folks might wonder where it comes from, and that's where it comes from.
Interesting. Didn't even know that.
Yeah.
So I have a couple questions that are just kind of like bouncing around in my head.
Sure.
And where to take it. Now I'm going to ask, I think, the harder one first.
Okay.
Which is, when you look at longevity over the lifespan of Homo sapiens, it's always gone up over decades and generations. The lifespan has been gradually increasing until about 5-6 years ago, when actually now it's on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
So walk us through if you guys are looking into that, or what do you think is that cause of now our lifespan getting shorter?
Well, there's a couple of things. One reason, as you probably know or can intuit if you're listening, that lifespan has increased is because of technological and medical innovation and advancement. So with the advent of vaccines, with the advent of penicillin, all of a sudden people were not dying when they broke their leg out in a field and it got infected, or they had pneumonia, and were able to recover from it now because they were able to combat the bacterial overgrowth with antibiotics. So that because our scientific paradigm and knowledge base had been expanding, that is one reason why over time you were seeing these incremental increases in longevity. And there's some disagreement over what that actually looks like. That's not my area of expertise. If you look at sort of the retrospective longitudinal data. But over the past 2 years since COVID, of course, lifespan has decreased, because look at what happened. And so, if we look at the collection of, really, if you consider like high net worth countries, Western nations, the medical cost is increasing, but lifespan is decreasing. And specifically, we're in the US. I know you may have international listeners, but we're here. And so I will reference the United States specifically. People may actually be living longer, but they're living sicker. And I don't know anyone who says, yeah, I'd love to live till 90. I'd spend my last 10 years, miserable in diapers with no autonomy and no ability to do anything. Now, I'm not suggesting those aren't years worth living. That's up to an individual and what they wish. But I think most rational people would say, I would prefer to be mobile and happy. And in fact, when I talk to a lot of folks in public about longevity, a lot of people will say to me, I only want to live until 75, because after that, it's all downhill. And it doesn't have to be. And David Sinclair talks a lot about that. I mean, he's the ultimate spokesperson for something like that. And I had the pleasure of working with him at my old company. He was the head of our scientific advisory board. So if anyone's interested, I would suggest checking out his book and listening to his talks and stuff, because he really nails it in terms of how we can mitigate that and what that may look like in the future. But the fact is that people really need to take responsibility for their longevity. And to some degree, in the United States, again, this is US specific, we don't have a great healthcare system. We have what I would call a sick care system. It is not preventative. It's not holistic. It's great if you have broken a leg, like as I told you, I just broke my foot last week. That's great. They're very helpful with that. That's reductionist sort of approach to medicine. But you know, there's very little emphasis, or there's been very little emphasis on the role of nutrition. Medical doctors will tell you, I got 1 hour of nutrition training in school. Maybe that's starting to change. There's very little, emphasis on mindfulness, on community, on happiness, on connection. And these are all things that, if we talk about the science of longevity, are really, really important. It's not just what you eat, it's also how you live. And so I would suggest that if we're seeing the quality of health span decline, that in large part it's because we really, in this country at least, have a very broken approach to health span and how we treat health and disease. If you wait for the entity to break down, it's very hard to fix it. It's like a road. Once the road is broken, there's a whole lot of construction. But if you just maintain the road preventatively, you wouldn't have to close it to have all that traffic and construction, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it totally does. And you kind of just solidified where I was looking at it from. It's from more lifestyle changes. It's from preventative diseases that are now killing more people than ever before, where if we just kind of took control over our own health and curved maybe our obesity rates and really took care of ourselves and got more education in fitness, got more education in nutrition, then we could actually do ourselves a favor by not only living longer, but being where we're 80 years old. We can go out, we can run around with our grandkids or great grandkids at that point and go on trips, because that's always the ultimate dream. And like you mentioned, especially here in the States, most people retiring in the mid 60s. And at that point, you would got what? You talk to an average person, I hear it all the time. Oh, you got 5 good years after that. And then it's all downhill, kind of like what you're suggesting, at where it shouldn't be. It's a lot easier to take control of yourself at a younger age and not think that you're invincible and that, no, not me, it's not going to happen. If you started those habits earlier than you could at that point, it's a lot easier just to maintain, go forward, and starting from scratch and putting it through all again.
Yeah. And you know what? I mean, I would also caution people against being too fatalistic or saying, it's too late for me now, because it's actually never too late. There is decent evidence in the scientific literature for people undertaking, pretty big interventions later in their life. And then we see an increase in lifespan and health span. For example, if someone is obese, and they become not obese through changing their diet and lifestyle. And by this, I mean not just something like bariatric surgery, but ensuring that you're then maintaining that with a whole food, plant-based diet, with proper exercise and sleep. That actually changes the trajectory of, for example, your biological age. So we can talk about that, which is something that we work on at FOXO, which is this chronological age, or your calendar age, versus your biological internal age. And one of the things we do in employing this epigenetic technology, which I'm happy to talk about if you want, is we use these biological clocks that assess these markers and tell you, hey, Anthony, I don't know how old you're 32 chronologically, but actually you're 27 biologically, because, you're functioning quite well.
Hey, a couple weeks out from 32. So
okay.
Thank you.
Somehow, how did I know? So, yeah. So, I mean, it's never too late is kind of what I wanted to say, to make those changes and to really see an impact. And we're working on measuring those impacts, which is a really nice thing.
Yeah, it's true on a couple of points of what you mentioned. I get it all the time. I get people walking into my gym and they're in their 70s and they go, I'm just here just to look around, but I'm not going to work out because, I'm already in my 70s. I'm too old. I was like, you're never too old to start. And you try showing them current research that came out, at least in our field, where it's actually people in their 70s, barring some medical conditions, can benefit from HIIT training, that's high intensity interval training. That's like your Orange Theory, really running, pushing themselves. They're going to have different heart rate zones, obviously, so because they're older, but they can still get their heart rate up to 60 to 70% of their max, and it's way beneficial for them. Where it used to be, just because you're old, we need to go slow. It's not true anymore.
No, and also, we live in quite an ageist society. If you look at these things, they're called implicit association tests. Malcolm Gladwell talks about it in his book about bias. But these are very common psychological tests. Ethicists use them. We just studied them in a class actually last week, and the majority of people in the world, actually, but certainly in the United States, are ageist, meaning implicitly, unconsciously, they have bias against age. And so I say that to your comment about the 70-year-old person who comes into the gym and goes, no, this isn't for me. I'm just here to look around. And you see that reflected in the medical profession. I don't remember if it was David Sinclair or Joe Rogan. I think when he was on one of his episodes, he said something to the effect of, I wanted a tooth replacement, a new tooth, something like that. And I think the dentist had told one of the guys, well, you're already 50 something, 60, whatever. You don't need a new tooth. I mean, basically you're old anyway. And David was like, I take offense to that. That's absurd. I have many more years of good life. And I say that only to say not every doctor might take that approach, but the idea that once you're old enough that a medical provider will say, well, don't even bother with the hip replacement because you're kind of at the end anyway. You're not able to move around. Well, that's silly, and that comes out of this implicit sort of latent bias that we have. That your life ends at a certain age, which is really silly because we have the technology, we have the knowledge, we have the means to improve people's lifespan if they so wish. And so I think it's really important, and that's why I'm super passionate about working on it and spreading that message. So people are like, oh, by the way, lots of your listeners are young, and you're never too young to start thinking about it either. When I was 20 something, I remember being like, oh, who cares about longevity? Because, you're in this mindset of I'm invincible. But very quickly, you realize, this is actually something I should be paying attention to.
30 was that age. You hit 30 and you're just like,
yeah,
oh, things are starting to hurt.
right.
I got to take better care of myself. So really, it's really funny because it's true. I want to talk a little bit about what you mentioned, biological age next to chronological age. But we're going to take a quick break here, word from our sponsor, and be right back, guys. So bear with us. For us, we know what it's like to feel unhealthy, depressed, and downright defeated. We want to show others there is a right way. And through fitness, you could do anything you set your mind to. Fitness can give you that motivation, confidence, energy you need to bridge that mental gap and prevent you from missing important life events. We understand it's about feeling better, living longer, and being good examples for our kids. We understand this because we live it. And for us, that's the redefined difference. Hey guys, and welcome back. We got Erin here talking all about genetic markers. We're talking about longevity. It's a lot going on right now, and we're going to dive into the difference between biological age and chronological age, which she briefly mentioned. But I want to ask a little more specifically on that. Is there any way without the use of blood or fancy machines in a lab that us as an average person can kind of figure out what our biological age is, whether we're older or younger than what our actual age is chronologically?
So we use epigenetic technology to measure your biological age. You need some tool to look inside to have a measure of biological age, so you can't just make it up. You could certainly say, I feel great, but as we all know, how someone feels isn't always an indication of what's brewing under the surface. So I would always recommend, hey, don't pay attention to how you feel, but also make sure that you go and get, your yearly physical and your blood tests, and be very attentive to all those things, especially if you're taking supplements or something like that. You do need to test. So I can really only comment on biological age as it's traditionally measured generally these days, which is we use microarray technology. And so we're looking at epigenetic signatures. And so In case folks are not familiar with that, you have your genes, with your genetics, right, which are inherited from mom and dad. That's what we think of when we think of 23andMe. They'll tell you, oh, you got these chromosomes, you have this mutation here and that one there, or you don't have any mutations and you're fine, right? And so they're looking at the manifestation of particular traits, sometimes disease, ancestry, things like that. Those are traits that are inherited, features that are inherited, right? I have naturally curly hair if you're watching the video, but I straighten it, right? And so they're able to look at things like that. Epigenetics is how those genes express themselves. And so that's really exciting because, as we all know, depending on the environment and how we live, all the things you talk about on the show, Anthony, the reason why it's important to move and not sit, or make sure that you're eating an abundance of colorful plants, hydrating enough, all those things, not smoking, having good relationships. That's because all of those things affect how your genes, which are the inherited components, express themselves. And at a very high level, we can think about epigenetics as these little tags or marks on the DNA that are telling that DNA sort of how to play the song or how to read the book, right? Because DNA is an instruction manual. And so that's why if you look at identical twins, for example, and you can look this up, there are pictures and scientific studies, or we have some on our website, you can see two people with exactly the same sets of DNA who are the same age, but they live different lifestyles. And one looks really old and one still looks fairly young, even though they have the same features. And so that's the impact of epigenetics, or your environment. And so the reason that we use that to look at biological age in these clocks is because we want to understand how is the environment affecting this. And the clocks that we have licensed from Steve Horvath's lab at UCLA, and Steve Horvath is credited with the genesis of one of the first multi-tissue clocks. So looking multi-tissue, whole body, not just looking at one particular cell type and an organ, to be able to say with some degree of accuracy, here's the sort of rate at which we believe you're aging. And here is, of course, there are error bars, but here is the general biological age. And then you can use that over time. The idea is to predict mortality, along with many other things. So at FOXO, we don't just use that. We're using many other markers as well. But from a novelty perspective, people in the public are always really interested. Either they're like, I don't want to know, or they're like, oh my God, how do I find out? And can this change over time? And the evidence so far is that, yes, it can change over time. So for example, if someone is morbidly obese, or they're a smoker and they stop smoking, or they are no longer obese because they change their lifestyle, then we see changes in biological age. And so it's really nice because it's affirmative that, your choices do, yes, have an impact on your lifespan. And in fact, here is empirical evidence with which you can measure that.
And this is, like I said, the first thing that's come into my mind, and I know this is the rebuttal. This is the rebuttal I get all the time.
Yeah.
So I want to hear it from you about, this is the definitive answer, what we tell these people. You always get the ones that come in and say, I have an aunt, uncle, brother, whatever it may be, that smoked 4 packs a day, drank a 12-pack, and lived till they were 100 and never had any health issues.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the answer to that? Mine is always, it's a probability game. And that's what I always pitch diet and exercise. If you have, you were born and you got a 20% chance of living to 100 being perfectly healthy, and then you start eating right, exercising, that now becomes 50% chance. It's not a definitive you're going to do it, but you're just increasing your odds. Now, if I took that and I started smoking, drinking, whatever, and had my environment negatively impact me, then that percent chance comes down to 5%. But it doesn't mean that I might make it or not. There's still a 5% chance that I will. It's still possible, but you're just playing with your odds of how to really stack the deck in your favor, because you always say, well, this person drank and smoked and they lived to 100, and this person was the epitome of health and they died at 50 of a heart attack. So that's how I try to explain it to people, overall odds. And I want to hear your answer and what you think of that.
My first answer to them is, Mazel tov to your relative who lived that long. Good job. Look, I'm being a little facetious. I generally tend to agree with you, but aging is a multifactorial process. So there's many different inputs, not about all of which we still currently understand. And there are statistical outliers. If anyone's read that book, another Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers, right? That'll explain it to you. There are statistical outliers. So you wouldn't say that just because somebody narrowly avoided death in a car crash without a seatbelt, that you should not have a seatbelt on, right? Someone says, well, my uncle didn't wear a seatbelt and he walked away from a crash with a semi trailer, a truck. You would say, well, oh my God, I'm so glad that your uncle walked away. The statistical probability that he would walk away is very, very, very low. And so I would say to the people who say, well, my aunt or uncle lived to 100 and smoked 3 packs a day, lived on whiskey and cake. I would say, wow, well, that's like the person who walked away from a car crash without a seatbelt. Doesn't mean you should not wear a seatbelt. There's always going to be outliers. We don't know why they exist. And also I would point out again that there are other factors, and that we think about age and we're looking at retrospective data from today back. Starting around the 60s and 70s, after after the World War II, we had this advent of, we had this additional sort of industrialization, a lot more chemicals, right? The food supply really changed. You had the advent of all these processed foods that did not exist before, factory farms. So the quality of what we're exposed to has changed quite drastically in the past 60 years. I would say 50 to 60 years. I mean, someone might debate me on the exact time, but if we're talking now in 2022 about someone who's over 100, that person was born in 1920. Their environment was very different. There are many things they were not exposed to. There may have been fewer chemicals in the food supply. The soil was more nutritious. Yes, there were many bad things back there too that we fixed. But I would just point out that it's not, that view is not, it's not necessarily clean data, because you're not looking at someone who's exposed to, for example, Anthony, what you and I have been exposed. I mean, I was born in 1980s. You might have been born in 1990. I'm trying to do the math, but still,
exactly.
we're born in the same era, which means that you and I are generally exposed to the same things in our environment that someone who's currently 110 years old wasn't exposed to for 50 years of their life. So what does that mean? So it's really not an apple to apple comparison for someone to say, well, my 120-year-old aunt had this. Well, yeah, but she might have grown up on a farm. She never ate a processed piece of food in her life until she was 50. I don't know. So I think that's important.
So maybe it's the buildup of these these chemicals that really play a role in the longevity. Because I mean, question one you learn when you're taking biology in high school is how much of a role is nature, how much of a role is nurture, which basically just means how much are you born with your genetic DNA, your makeup from your parents. This determines how long you're going to live, depending on how much of that is your environment and how you have that impact your life. Is there anything we're missing inside this argument? Because I'm sure you get it a lot, like what the difference is between the nature versus nurture argument as far as longevity goes.
Yeah, I would say one thing that most folks are not really talking about is, which is maybe more of in the realm of sociology or ethics, is this idea of social determinants of health, meaning that there is an element of privilege and of disparity and unfairness when we talk about, well, people should just change their diet so they're not insulin resistant. Listen, that's a whole other bag of worms here, but our microbiome is inherited from mom during vaginal birth. And if it's not a vaginal birth and it's a C-section, then soon thereafter from interaction with the parents, skin to skin contact, et cetera. And then the microbiome is mediated throughout life. But there is some evidence, and this is not my area of expertise, that the early microbiome and what that child is fed until between the ages of 0 and 4 or something like that has a massive impact on what that microbiome looks like throughout their life, may predispose them to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, dysregulated lipid levels. Those are things that you weren't necessarily born with, but you were exposed to in your environment. And when we talk about social determinants, we have to think, at least in America, about the wide disparity of how, the range of ways people live, the things they have access to. There are food deserts. There's lack of education and awareness. There are folks who just eat fast food because they don't have much money, and it's subsidized, and they don't know better potentially. This is not to indict them. This is just to say that it's a really big problem we have. And so I'm very careful about saying, people should be able to mediate these potential comorbidities, because in many cases it's not fair, and it can be attributed to sort of this idea of distributive justice, and that's a whole different conversation. But I like to bring it into the biology convo because it's really important to consider, how did people grow up and where did they come from, and not everybody is starting at the same starting block regardless of genetics. So they're both important. They're both really important. And the degree to which they're weighted, that's really up for debate. And I don't think anyone knows 100%. So I certainly couldn't tell you. I don't know that anyone really could.
Yeah, and at the social determinants, which is what you were talking about, just a little point in there. I don't want to poke. It's not one person's fault, just a full disclosure. But I think a lot plays in the role with what we're taught, especially at a young, impressionable age, and talking elementary schools and stuff like that. I went through, like yourself, in the 80s, 90s. We never learned how to eat right. We never learned the importance of physical education. And that played a lot of roles when we got older, because we're like, well, if the schools aren't teaching us and they're not developing those habits at a young age, how do you expect somebody coming out of that, especially even go through college, and that person's 24, 25, to develop a habit of eating right and going to the gym and exercise and know what they're doing, when it was just flat out never taught, period. I remember PE, for example, was every other day, and you basically didn't even have to change anymore, because the parents would just say, hey, my kid doesn't need to do PE. They would sit out to go to the library. So now you're having kids that aren't even exercising, period. They're not learning, and they're not really teaching you about why you need to exercise. It's more just, okay, we're going to play a game instead of, when we get older, maybe we'll play games, but we're also, our most time on fitness is going to be spent in the gym. So maybe we should spend more time with how to exercise. What are the different muscle groups that we're working on today? And you don't really get taught that whatsoever.
Yeah, it depends how you grow up, right? As you said. So yeah, I grew up in the 80s, but I was very fortunate to have sort of, I call them hippie parents, who were feeding me, carob and greens and all this really alternative food. That there was no Whole Foods, there was no Sprouts Market. Like this was not cool. This was me being a kid going to school embarrassed because my lunchbox smelled really weird. And my parents, I still make fun of it to this day. I'm like, remember when you guys gave me these fake cookies, and they were called Frookies, and they were sweetened with fruit juice, because my parents would not allow me to consume anything with high fructose corn syrup. And I remember teachers even telling me, oh, your parents are being ridiculous. There's nothing wrong with corn syrup. Well, as it turns out, mom and dad were right not to let their kid eat that stuff. So I joke about it, because as a child, all I wanted was a Happy Meal, and I never got one. But as an adult, I'm real happy that I didn't get those things. But most people, like you say, that's not how they grew up. Now it's a little bit different. It's more mainstream. You have Whole Foods. You don't have to go to the local shop that smells like B vitamins, which I used to have to do as a kid. But yeah, again, it is social, right? It's about the community you grow up with. And to some degree, that's luck of the draw. You're lucky to be born into that, or you're not. So I like to point that out, that we cannot fault individuals always on an individual level.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, but I want to bring it back, obviously, because we're really talking about kind of what FOXO is, what kind of genetic markers you're looking at. You mentioned gene expression and how you were talking. I know this is back even like 10 minutes, but
it's all good.
Identical twins, so they have the same exact set of DNA, but then those genes get expressed differently. And I'm sure everyone knows at least somebody who's an identical twin, and you can always tell some things apart from them because of their environment around them and how they're doing. So as someone listening, I guess the question is, what should be a next step from a consumer standpoint, as far as how do we really figure out how to live longer? And then the flip side of that, I know you were talking about life insurance in the very beginning of the show, and how you're working with life insurance companies, because obviously you want people to live longer. That's the point. But not
Right.
only live longer so they can function in their 80s and 90s. So what are you pushing out to the public as a consumer through life insurance companies, through FOXO itself, to help us understand how to take better control and what we should do moving forward?
Sure. So there's a couple of questions in there. So
Yeah, it
I'll
was a
break it down.
lot.
No, it's good. It's good. It's good. I love it. I'll break it down by, I guess, answering the last part first, which is, what is FOXO doing, and then what can people do to improve their potential health and lifespan, which is another conversation, although it's integral to what we're doing at FOXO. So yes, as you mentioned, FOXO Technologies, where I am our chief product officer. We're a longevity company. We're using molecular science and technology, currently epigenetic science, which is this science of gene expression, as we were just mentioning, to evaluate markers of mortality and morbidity. And so in terms of what the consumer gets, in addition to a life insurance policy, and as you alluded to, it's a really great conflation of interests, because if anyone knows how life insurers are run, or even if you don't, it's in the insurance carrier's best interest to have people live longer, right? You don't want to pay out the policy. You want people to keep paying the premium, right? And no one wants anyone to die. So of course it's in their interest. And from the consumer perspective, no one wants to die. They want to live longer and they want to live better. Traditionally, life insurance was just there to say, hey, everyone's going to die. And so you're going to have this insurance as to afford your family fiscal protection and peace of mind, which is absolutely important. And we've seen that, especially during the COVID pandemic. But our thought was, yes, that's important, but it's about life. Like, life insurance should be about keeping you alive, not just protecting your assets. So now we have this technology available to us. Why would we not apply it? And so from a consumer perspective, in addition to the policy, our consumers will receive what we're calling a longevity report. And that longevity report contains your biological age, as well as a number of epigenetic scores that we've developed in the areas of cardiovascular, metabolic, inflammation, health, and something we call an indulgence score, which can look at how drinking and smoking has been affecting your health. And so that's all just based on a single spit tube. So when you're approved for your policy, we mail you a kit, just like kind of 23andMe has that little kit that most folks have probably seen by now, and you spit in the tube, close it, put it back in the box, send it away, and shortly thereafter, you get a note saying, hey, your report's ready, log in and check it out. Process people are fairly familiar with. And so the thinking is that that's one component that the consumer is getting, and we really believe it's directionally orienting people to a picture of the trajectory of their health. Am I moving in the right direction, or am I moving in the wrong direction? This is not a diagnostic. It's not a therapeutic. It's really for the consumer to engage with, to say, okay, I have a picture of my biological age now, and I have a picture of how I might be doing in these areas. Now, some folks are very familiar with at least the other areas because they're doing blood testing and they're very into it, but most people are not. And then also down the line, what we're doing that's really cool, and this is just relevant more to life insurance, is applying this epigenetic longevity technology to really change the machinery of life insurance altogether. So if most folks listening are probably too young to have gotten a large life insurance policy, but they may be aware that when you do get a policy, particularly when it's of significant size, they have to send a phlebotomist to your house. You got to take all this blood, you got to pee in a cup, you got to answer a million questions, right? It's no longer this accelerated digital process of underwriting. And that's really invasive. People don't like it. It takes a long time. It's bad for everyone. The industry, the consumer experience, no one likes it. And so we were like, well, wait a second. Why don't we change this? And so the idea is that taking this saliva-based epigenetic technology, we will ultimately be able to replace the need for blood and urine, making it more accessible to more people, quicker, painless, cheaper, ideally. And so really, it's a win-win for everyone. And so I'm super excited about it, because I'm like, well, everyone loves to disrupt an industry, but also in a way that really benefits life and humanity. Man, that's great.
Yeah, definitely. It keeps it way more interesting. I never had to go through that process, but I just envisioning a phlebotomist showing up. They're like, all right, sit down, and you're drawing blood, and then the people that pass out because of needles. So it definitely just helps a wide array industry just to kind of spit into it. And I'm comparing what you mentioned about 23andMe and how they give you your genetic markers. And I remember one day I did the ancestry one, which is the
Mhm.
same thing. I'm looking at it, and 2 points that are very interesting through it. The first one is when we talk about, and I don't really want to dive into it, I just want to know why.
Mhm.
You have mom and dad's DNA comes through, and it's saying, based on your DNA, you're from Italy, this region, whatever. That's where you're more to. But I know that's more from gene expression. So you're not getting a straight 50-50 from mom and dad, which is why I'm different from my siblings. And we don't have the same ethnic background, per se. It might be a couple percentage points off, and it has been for my whole family, which is very intriguing. Just shows what's expressing. And then the flip side of that is they show you these, like, what's your metabolic response? What's your vitamin A response? And which is pretty interesting. A couple of them just are flat out wrong. And the one I think of right away, which is silly, is I have photosensitivity from my mom's side, but it
Yep.
says I definitely don't have photosensitivity. So I go
You.
out and I sneeze every time I'm in the sun, but it's saying you definitely don't have that. So is the technology that they're using just not there, but you guys have it? Or is there something more intertwined with that?
So we're not using, I have the same, by the way, I had the same result with photosensitivity, sneezing in sunlight for anyone who's not familiar. And I'm the same way. Like if I feel like I have a sneeze coming on, I'll just look up at a light fixture and then I'll be able to sneeze, right?
Instant.
And it's like, no, you don't have that. And there's quite a few things that it told me no on or yes on that were just empirically incorrect because I know my body. That doesn't mean that the technology they're using is wrong. That means that, look, it's still an emerging area, and so a lot of times these traits are multifactorial, and so the researchers may not have necessarily in every demographic population been able to pinpoint the appropriate areas of the genome that are implicated in this exact phenotype. So when they're telling you no, they're using collections of data from GWAS studies, genome-wide association studies, to say, okay, we have this broad, massive set of data in these different populations, and it's a statistical analysis. And ultimately, I mean, at a very high level. And so it's just possible that there are alleles that are not included, that different people may have something in a different location of the genome, that there could be an error, sure, in the sequencing or what have you, although that's probably less likely in this particular case. It's not a perfect science when you're talking about those very individual traits because there's differences in demographic groups. For example, Caucasians have been genetically sequenced at a much greater in a much greater proportion than folks, let's say, from Latin America or certain other demographic populations. Now, they're going to probably have demographic observable differences in their genomes, and that's why it's important to do these studies in all these different populations. So that could be one reason. Again, it could just be because they're using an algorithm to determine, all these different alleles are affecting this trait, and they missed one. I mean, I can't speak exactly to that, but it certainly explains why this is an imperfect science in terms of your genetics. It's not a highly penetrant trait. There are these Mendelian traits that are highly penetrant, something like Huntington's disease, Tay-Sachs disease. Those things, if you have that genetic propensity, it's not even a propensity, it is a certainty, you will manifest that disease. Those are very, very easy to note, but most traits are not highly penetrant like that. Therefore, it's harder to determine what
I guess like Alzheimer's would be a great example. I know there's a gene expression or marker for Alzheimer's, but it doesn't necessarily mean if you have it or not that you may get Alzheimer's, because I've seen it across the board, which is not so just one of those like iffier side effects. But like you said, with Huntington's disease, it's a little easier to say, okay, this is the exact marker for this. You will develop this in your life, or you will have problems from it this way. Is that per se true?
Yeah, I would note with Alzheimer's, it's not gene expression. It's that when you hear about, these different genes implicated in Alzheimer's, it's the gene itself that they're looking at. They're looking at, do you have this variant? Do you have this different allele that you may have inherited either from mom or from dad, or one from each of them, that may, in combination with other genetic markers, predispose you to be 2 times more likely to develop dementia at some point in your life. But again, that's also based on these very large genome-wide association studies. And some of them are very well powered and they can tell us very important things. But when it comes to diseases that are multifactorial like that are highly dependent on the environment as well. Did you drink a lot during your life? If you did, you're probably not going to have many good outcomes at the end. If you're lucky, you'll be okay. But the likelihood is that heavy drinkers are going to experience cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, greater propensity for cancer. Same thing with folks who eat a lot of red meat or processed foods. So these are fairly well established. Yes, there are always outliers, but again, we don't not wear the seatbelt because one person survived the crash. So it's that as well. And as the science of epigenetics unfolds and evolves and becomes more robust, I think we'll really see interesting applications in the areas of diseases like Alzheimer's, which are, or Parkinson's or whatever, which are cancer, highly contingent upon gene expression and the interaction of your genetic material with the environment. What's triggering it? What is the environment telling it to do? And how can you mediate that? And that's the power of it. And that's, I think, really exciting. That's what gets me excited anyway.
It's very interesting. And I'm gonna start wrapping this up. And I usually ask the same two questions for everybody, but I'm gonna throw in a third one and I'm gonna ask it first. What is, in your opinion, if you were to tell somebody and they're like, listen, Erin, I got 15 seconds with you. What is the number one recommendation you have for me to look forward to do? What is that?
For longevity?
For longevity.
Eat plants, baby.
Eat plants. Nice and simple. I love it.
90% plant-based diet, whole food plant-based diet, no processed stuff or limited. Yeah, there's very, very, very strong evidence that comports nicely with longevity outcomes.
Eat your greens. I absolutely love it. All right, last two questions I asked everyone are going to be exactly the same. The first one is, if you were to summarize this episode in 2 sentences, what would it be?
Longevity is attainable for all. Genes are not your destiny. So change how you live and you can change the course of your life.
I absolutely love it. And then the easiest question of all, which is, where can people find you, get a hold of you? How can they really just implement this as part of their lives? So break us down how people can get a hold of you, Erin. Go for it.
Oh, sure. Well, thankfully, no one else so far in this world has my name. So if you just type in erinsharoni.com, I have a website. I'm also there on Instagram and Twitter. I haven't used Twitter as heavily in the past couple of years, as I think many people have been like, it's a bit much. But I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn. People can LinkedIn add me on LinkedIn, Erin Sharoni. Again, my name, it's just one of me. So unless there are any imposters, if you see one, send them my way. But you can connect with me that way. And then I would also suggest just check out FOXO Technologies. We have tons of info on our website. You can hit us up, talk to our team through a chat box. They're happy to answer any questions. We love hearing from people, and we love helping folks live better longer.
And thank you guys for joining us on this week's episode of Health and Fitness Redefined. Don't forget, hit that subscribe button and join us next week as we dive deeper into this ever-changing field. And remember, fitness is a journey, not a destination. Until next time.